open ahead of us. This is what we intend to do today with our contribution to the topic. And with my presentation, I will reason why we should have the narrative on fragility behind and look into the opportunities to exploit the potential. FAO's evolving program on fragility did achieve very specific results under its Building Forward initiative, which I will very briefly show you. So I guess you're able to scan the code on the screen. If not, please do that with your mobile phone. And you will be able to go through the website of the Building Forward Better initiative of FAO. Next, please. So that's basically what you will see if you scan the code, if you already scanned the code on your mobile phone, which is the website of our initiative. The initiative, as it is official name, called Strengthening National Natural Resources Capacities to Revitalize Agriculture in Fragile Context, is built around the context that the loss of human capacity provoked by fragility must be recovered to achieve a sustainable natural resource management. There are mutual benefits actually of the process, as improved capacities are fundamental for protecting natural resources, and improved natural resources management can build productive assets for people. So I do really invite you to explore later the website. And as you will see, natural resource management is approached from 13 thematic areas, and the initiative applies a multi-level approach to address knowledge gaps of local human capital at national level by promoting an expert network of peer-to-peer exchange of knowledge through digital tools, and at global level, as the next presentation will detail, by developing a fragile mapping to identify natural resources-driven fragility. So let's now go further into the triangle of dryland, drought, and fragility. I believe we are all familiar with the dryland context, but let me recap some of the key figures that characterized the areas and regions we are discussing. Global lands are estimated to be covered by 40% of drylands. Areas classified as hyper-arid, arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid, according to the aridity index. Although often considered marginal and little productive, drylands host a variety of different ecosystems. In terms of population, drylands are home to over 2 billion people. 1 out of 3 individuals in the world live in a dryland area. Considering these figures, it does not come as a surprise that a large share of global poor inhabits these regions and have very limited basic services. Population actually in these contexts are more subject than others to frequent and several natural phenomena like droughts we have been discussing during the last couple of days. But we should always consider the different functions of drylands and the benefits they provide in terms of food security, protection of biodiversity and ecosystems, and contribution to regulate climate. Next, please. In light of this, it is legitimate for one to ask, are dry lands a case of fragile context? Let's review first one of the widest applied definition of fragile environment as outlined by the OECD. I quote, "The combination of exposure to risk and insufficient coping capacity of the states, systems, and communities to manage, absorb, or mitigate those risks. Potentiality leading to violence, poverty, inequality, displacement, and environment and political degradation." If you agree with me, according to this definition, we consider fragile those systems that cannot cope with different shocks and need to improve their resilience of both human and natural livelihoods. By default, then, drylands have limited resources to develop restoration capacities and buffer extreme climate events such as drought. So the extreme sensitivity and exposure then can lead to crippling situation when livelihoods are impacted. Next, please. So the multidimensional fragility of drylands is shaped by different factors. In terms of climate factors, decrease in precipitation rates and increase of evaporation of water are the driving forces. In terms of political dimensions, causes of fragility are associated to marginalized and underrepresented groups of population, while lower capacity to influence political decisions and often subject to weak rule of laws and more frequent conflicts. From a demographic perspective, the growth of population results in additional pressure on resources, frequently beyond regenerative capacity. And last, from human stresses are represented by the unsustainability of some economic activities, including inadequate farming techniques, mining, overgrazing, and inefficient uses of water. Next, please. Fragility is not a predetermined conditions that distinguish all drylands, not even drought-prone drylands. To move away from a vulnerability condition, a precondition is always needed to be fulfilled, and this is the development of adaptive capacities and the strengthening of resilience. Firstly, the implementation of disaster risk management approaches, which is often pursued. Addressing fragility in these contexts will require additional efforts to tailor measures towards specific dynamics of poverty, while humanitarian and emergency assistance will always be required. We must acknowledge that it is a more expensive modality to reduce impacts from shocks. Social protection should thus complement it to reduce vulnerability, in particular of households and communities. Access to market is a valuable measure. Investment should also be directed to establish the above local level markets, integrated and competitive, targeting settings to reduce barriers and enhance resilience. And finally, learning, monitoring, and evaluation process to improve on one side technical capacities and on the other to strengthen institutional decision-making are crucial. Before I conclude, last please, I would like to recall some of the challenges discussed during these days to shed a light on the linkages with the subject of today's event. Climate and environmental changes are happening as we talk, and the most vulnerable population are adapting also through mobility. It's not a reversible process, and it is going to increase over years. the context of fragility, drought, dry land has many different forms which must be addressed in different ways. Developing capacities of local human capital in agriculture is thus critical to identify long-term solutions. And with this, I thank you, and I hope I set the scene for our session today, but let me move further and go into a number of technical presentations. And let me start first with a presentation to cover the natural resources dimension of fragility. With this, we will have a recorded presentation by Mr. Nick Volvolis, a professor of environmental technology at the Imperial College of London, to give us a short, let's say, insights into the natural resources dimension of fragility. So I leave you listening and seeing it.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for inviting me to give a talk on the natural resources dimension of fragility. My name is Nick Volvolis. I am a professor of environmental technology at the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College in London. And the title of my talk is Drylands and Natural Resources Driven Fragility. Fragility is conceptualized by the OECD as the combination of exposure to risks and the insufficient coping capacity of a state, a system, or a community to manage, absorb, and mitigate those risks. It poses a major global threat to the achievement of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and to sustaining peace, especially considering the impacts of the current COVID-19 pandemic. Issues related to the environment directly shape the drivers of fragility. Although environmental factors are rarely favored the sole cause of conflicts and social unrests, the exploitation of natural resources and related environmental stresses can be implicated in raising fragility and leading to conflict. For example, in the last 60 years, at least 40% of all intrastate conflicts had a link to natural resources. And since 1990, at least 18 violent conflicts have been fueled by the exploitation of natural resources. Restricted and unequal access to natural resources and an improper management, coupled with environmental constraints, are putting efforts for development at risk. Under these conditions, the capacity of the poorest to deal with global pressures on resources is undermined, and food security is threatened. The emerging consensus is that environmental factors and natural resources scarcity can be amongst the main drivers of fragility, as ecosystems with limited coping capacities are less resilient to stresses and shocks. However, risks related to natural resources and their management are often overlooked or misdiagnosed in analysis of fragility, leading to missed opportunities for designing effective responses. One way of looking at natural resources is through the water, energy and food nexus. Delivering water, energy and food for all in a sustainable and equitable way is one of the major challenges faced by our societies. For example, globally, 2.2 billion people do not have access to safely managed drinking water, 940 million do not have access to electricity, and 811 million do not have access to adequate food. Fair access to and effective management of these resources is essential to public health, state legitimacy, livelihood security, and economic prosperity. All of these are necessary components to countering fragility and fostering stability. This is the reason why the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has joined forces with us here at the Center for Environmental Policy at the Imperial College in London on an ambitious project under the Building Forward Better initiative to develop a tool for the mapping of natural resources driven fragility. Again, we followed a water, energy and food nexus approach in which we calculated the availability and demand difference for water, energy and food in each country creating an integrated ref nexus score, calculated as a net surplus or deficit across the nexus as a more explicative indicator that can be used to make decisions on policies and technology selection and optimization. For example, if a country has enough energy but not water, a candidate to consider is desalination. Similarly, a country that doesn't have enough energy but water, you could think of biofuels and other technologies like aquaponics in the case of food and so on. So we looked at these three resources in terms of availability and demand. We looked at internal renewable water resources per country, and also the total freshwater withdrawal, total production of energy and total consumption per country, and also food production and food supply. We then integrate these as resources deficits or surpluses, which we use later as an indicator of fragility. For example, here you can see resources, reserves, or deficits per country in terms of water, energy, and food. Now, for this, we have actually taken into account, when we calculate demand, not just the current demand, but the demand that we would expect if the rest of the world has reached the same level of development across the planet. So on the left, you can see with red countries, for example, that don't have enough water to meet their water needs. On the right, countries in red that do not have energy, or the energy consumed is more than the energy produced. And the same situation with food for those that are red. The green ones are the ones that have a surplus in terms of these resources. We also take into account a number of confounding factors, parameters that affect the fragility as well. These are related to the economy, the economic development and growth, and access to technology, the management of the natural resources, and also climate change elements that might affect the overall fragility of a state. This is an example of how the integrated map looks like, and here you can see with red countries that overall they have less resources available than what they need to meet the needs of their citizens. Now let's look at drylands. Drylands are defined by the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification as regions with an aridity index of between 0.05 and 0.65. Where the aridity index is the ratio of annual precipitation to potential evapotranspiration. Drylands are important areas. They cover 41.3% of the Earth's land surface, including 15% in Latin America, 66% in Africa, 40% in Asia, and 24% in Europe. They are home to more than 2.1 billion people, 90% of which live in developing countries. Drylands normally refer to arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid areas, and in general exclude deserts or hyper-arid areas when referred to in the context of sustainable development. Overall, they are characterized by limited water availability, high temperature fluctuations, and an average annual precipitation rate below 2/3 of the annual potential evapotranspiration. Drylands are most valuable and rich biodiversity, made up of forests, grasslands, and agricultural areas. The first global assessment of dryland forests found that drylands include 2/3 of the land area of 7 biodiversity hotspots and contain 1.1 billion hectares of forest, corresponding to over a quarter of the world's forest area. So this is a map of countries according to their percentage of their total area covered by drylands. So for example, the ones in red are those that more than 90% of their area is actually designated as drylands. There are two more categories in terms of the extent of coverage by drylands, and they're easier to show in the next slide. So here, in addition to the first group, which is the countries with 90% of their land covered by drylands, the second group is those countries that have land between 30 to 90% covered by drylands, and the last group on the right is those that have less than 30% of their land covered by drylands. These groupings are interesting because we'll use them to do some further analysis. Here, for example, you see that countries with a high percentage of drylands have significantly less water available and produce less food. Also, some of them indeed produce more energy. Water, food, and energy security are crucial for sustainable long-term economic growth and human well-being, and there are strong linkages between them. It is important to understand how these are limited in drylands because they are the reasons that drive some of the fragility we see in these areas. So drylands are extremely vulnerable to climatic variations and water stress. They're also extremely vulnerable to damaging human activities such as deforestation, overgrazing, and unsustainable agricultural practices, which cause land degradation. When we refer to land degradation, we really refer to the loss of the biological or economic productivity of land. Desertification reduces agricultural output, contributes to droughts, and increases human vulnerability to climate change. The pace of land degradation has actually accelerated in recent years, reaching 30 to 35 times the historical rate. Urbanization, mining, farming, and ranching are some of the causes for this. Today, more than 2 billion hectares of previously productive land is degraded. On the other hand, when we look at current indicators of fragility, this is an example from the Fragile States Index, which is developed by the Fund for Peace. You can see here the scores of fragility in different colors. Now, when we group these countries based on their coverage of their land by drylands, we see that, as you can see the figure on the left, that countries with a higher percentage of their land covered by drylands are generally more fragile, which indicates that maybe our hypothesis is correct. This is from the map I showed you earlier with the results of our WEF Nexus Fragility Score, where indeed the ones that are shown to be more fragile are actually countries with a high percentage of their land covered by drylands. So what does it all mean? Natural resources, climate change, and fragility are deeply linked. And natural resource disputes are becoming increasingly frequent with population and income growth, the introduction of new extraction techniques, and countries' greater vulnerability to natural disasters and climate change. As the demand and pressure for natural resources grow significantly, the potential for resource-based conflict is becoming of greater concern. In the context of drylands, the link to fragility is clear. Nevertheless, challenges can be transformed into opportunities and scarcity into prosperity. Investing in dryland ecosystems can simulate positive socioeconomic and environmental developments. Restoring rangelands and sustainable land management practices can preserve dryland biodiversity, restore ecosystem functions, and halt land degradation. While breaking the link between state fragility and natural resources is challenging, effective natural resource management is crucial to building resilience. Systematic, fair, inclusive, and responsive natural resources governance is vital to effective climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts and integral to preventing conflict. Effective managing natural resources and climate change through domestic and regional policy measures, such as monitoring and better management of water, energy, food nexus interactions, trade, and strategic interventions can strengthen resilience and development. Policies that allow for the sustainable and equitable use of natural resources, building resilience for communities, and protecting against environmental degradation are all important components of these policies. In general, through this path, the environment, natural resources, and climate change serve as key components for reducing fragility and conflict. So before I close, I should also thank Anna Freeman and Piers Cooper, who work with me at Imperial, but also Maher Salman and Stefania Giusti, FAO, who have commissioned this project and work with us. You can also see here my contact details. If you want to contact me or if you have any questions, I will be more than happy to help.
Thank you very much. Actually, maybe virtually we can applaud Nick in London. So in London at the Imperial College, the most interesting part, as you see, of the work is really the mapping and the layering of the tri-dimensions we were talking about addressing it, and it's a continuous work between the Imperial College of London and FAO. So we have seen now the dimension of the natural resources. Let's go further and see together the policy dimension, and I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Hind Aisui Benani, Regional Specialist of Migration, Environment and Climate Change from the International Organization for Migration, to give us a short speech on the policy dimension of fragility. Please, Hind.
Thank you very much, Maher. Hi, everyone. And first of all, allow me to thank the colleagues of FAO for inviting us at this important event, and for the awesome organization. Thank you very much as well. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. So I was asked to give an intervention on the policy dimension of fragility. Thank you so much for this opportunity. As IOM gives a central importance placed to the policy work, policy dialogue, and policy coherence when it comes to human mobility in the context of climate change, environmental degradation, and disaster. For starters, allow me to quote IOM's institutional strategy on migration, environment, and climate change, which, duration is from 2021 to 2023, 2030, of which, so I quote, supporting policy coherence and enhancing partnerships is one of the 6 guiding principles. The development of this strategy is rooted in a wide understanding of the issues at stake and the belief that a comprehensive approach is necessary to respond to the immense variety of migration challenges and opportunities linked to climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters. The strategy is, end of quote. Having said that, let's set the scene to understand the realities in which policies should be rooted when addressing not only fragility, but also human mobility in fragile contexts, characterized by climate change and also, not always, but also by conflict. As I am sitting in IOM's regional office for West and Central Africa in Dakar, so my my examples will be much more rooted in the region, even though I will also talk about a more continental perspective. So, first of all, really to stress this, this figure. So human mobility, it's very important, is also an adaptation strategy to climate change. It's not like enough recognized as such, but it's very important to stress that human mobility is part of the adaptation strategies to climate change. In a continent hosting 37% of the world's nomadic population, and in which labor migration has always been a way for rain-fed rural communities to cope with the environmental pressures. In 2017, there were 18 million migrant workers in Africa, with a high level of low-skilled workers who were mostly attracted to natural resources dependent sectors such as agriculture, mining, and fisheries. I think this figure is is important because it shows that not only climate change, environmental changes are the root causes of migration, a reason, to move from one territory, but it's also a pull factor. Environment is definitely, our natural resources are definitely attracting people for opportunities, and definitely this labor migration dimension is very, very important when it comes to this reality. So we have conducted, several studies, for example, in Sierra Leone, in Côte d'Ivoire, and also in Guinea, and it shows that the great dynamism of such human mobility within the region. In countries like Guinea, for example, who are perceived as being important emitters of international migrants towards north. So it's very important also to say that in these countries, they do also host migrants and labor migrants. It's very important also to pay attention to the protection of these migrants and not like putting the social rights and human rights of these migrants in opposition to the environmental rights of the host communities. So having like this holistic approach at local level is very important. When it comes to conflict, while conflict and fragility is impacting the ability of communities to move and sometimes forcing them to immobility, this is another reality that I would like just to stress or to highlight. The capacity of these very communities to adapt to climate change is made even harder. So these dynamics are, by the way, brilliantly demonstrated in the report titled When Rain Turns to Dust that ICRC published early 2020, mentioning examples from the Sahel. So not everyone has the option to move, which results in more or less forced immobility, which will be associated with acute forms of vulnerability and risk. These are the main reasons why this is important, not only to consider human mobility in the context of climate change, but also to frame it correctly. Within the climate security nexus, human mobility shouldn't be framed as a risk, but as a strength on the adaptation front. It's too often framed as a risk, and there is a risk that human mobility or migration is being instrumentalized within this nexus. So now that we have set the scene, let's focus on how to address these realities, including through policy work. IOM is engaging on the African continent through several initiatives that we believe should be looked at to better understand how to concretely address human mobility in the context of climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters, so that it contributes to strengthen the resilience of communities. When I say address, I mean to develop solutions in this context for people to move, solutions for people on the move, and solutions for people to stay. This is also, the third pillars of IOM's strategy on migration, environment, and climate change. So I repeat, solutions for people to move, so solutions for people on the move, and solutions for people to stay. In Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal, for example, thanks to the support of France, my colleagues, Emma is here, the project officer, are implementing a project on urban and peri-urban agriculture to promote the protection of labor migrants, as well as the development of nature-based solutions with the host communities and the migrants. With this project, we intend to demonstrate the essentiality of labor migrants in agriculture and the importance of looking at small and medium-sized farmers as allies from the private sector to develop nature-based solutions and create decent jobs for labor migrants. Here again, it's very important also for us to have this holistic approach, as I said before, not opposing the social and human rights, the protection rights, let's say, of labor migrants and the environmental rights of the host communities. It's extremely important to design and develop solutions that benefit to all. In the East and Horn of Africa, IOM has recognized that the potential positive role that labor migration, including diaspora engagement, can play in climate change adaptation and risk mitigation is at times weakened by the lack of linkages and coherence between migration and labor market policies and practices, including labor market information and jobs and skills matching of nationals and migrants. IOM is working on policy coherence in Kenya and Somalia, where we are firstly assessing the policy landscape in these two countries with an emphasis on national development and the green economy, and then identifying entry points to integrate human mobility into the relevant policy. So the mobilization of diaspora is very important and often overlooked in terms of potential to to address fragility. So since 2015, significant progress has been made in integrating human mobility in the context of climate change, environmental degradation and disasters into key international frameworks and commitments, including the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the 2015 Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, adopted in 2018. Such progress are also reflected within the recommendations made in New Delhi in 2018 at COP14. In the decision 22 CP14, the Conference of the Parties formulated a set of recommendations to the parties, including one specific recommendation to parties from the Africa region and to the Secretariat. All these recommendations encourage to take action on the migration and desertification, land degradation, drought nexus. However, there are still many gaps that need to be filled. The issue of scaling up finance when it comes to human mobility in this context is a fundamental topic. It has been pointed out in several discussions as a priority by governments. While there has been growing recognition of human mobility in this context, in the global narrative, the funding landscape is a different story. Funding sources remain scarce, but finance related to human mobility in this context is emerging. Filling the policy gap is a good first step to further stimulate the financing of environmental migration and disaster displacement, but we also need to guide the donors on what kind of action they need to fund. Last March in Dakar, IOM actively contributed to the World Water Forum, where we piloted with the Executive Secretariat of the Forum the formulation of recommendations on water and migration in the context of rural development. The forum was the first ever to include migration into its core discussions. So in conclusion, these recommendations tell us the importance of the policy dialogue and inter-sectoral cross-fertilization policy work. They also tell us the need to support strongly research and education, but they are also very clear on the need to engage seriously on climate migration financing. To ensure that joint actions are informed by sound and accurate data and analysis, AFDB and IOM are engaged collaboratively to support knowledge products on climate-induced forced displacement and migration. The objective is to come up with contextualized and tailored solutions to local realities and circumstances, such as desertification, to prevent forced displacement and harness benefit of migration for climate adaptation and environmental sustainability. So migration must be seriously considered in the financing of adaptation. I think I've been clear on that. And through the creation of a dedicated fund, investment in infrastructure must prioritize access to water for the most vulnerable and migrants, and the private sector must be more involved in preserving water resources and ensuring the social rights of migrant workers. They also tell us that climate migration finance needs to be accessible, as water needs to be accessible for the most vulnerable. So I will end on this. Thank you very much for your attention, and I remain available for any further questions.
Thanks very much, Hind, and really appreciation to the International Organization for Migration for being with us and highlighting the policy dimension of fragility. Now, the third dimension of fragility is the economic dimension. And with this, we have Mr. Anupam Anand, the Senior Evaluation Officer at the GEF program, to give us also some insights on the economic dimension. And we will have it again recorded. Thanks very much. Please.
I am a Senior Evaluation Officer at the Independent Evaluation Office of the GEF, and today I'll be speaking about the economic dimension of fragility based on a recent evaluation of the GEF support to fragile and conflict affected situation. Before I move ahead, I would like to thank our colleagues from FAO for organizing this very important event at the UNCCD COP. So, for those who do not know about the GEF, it's a financial mechanism for 5 major UN environmental conventions, including the UNCCD. It was established ahead of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and over the last 3 decades, it has supported around 5,000 projects across 170 countries. And while doing so, it has provided more than $21 billion in grants and has leveraged around $114 billion in co-financing. So when you look at the fragile and conflict affected situation, they overlap with GEF interventions. So here's a map of GEF supported protected area overlaid with the areas of fragility and conflict. And you can see that the red areas, or the shades of red, represent the area which has seen a lot of conflict fatality. And at the same time, you can see a lot of GEF projects are situated in those areas. So using this, we conducted a more in-depth analysis based on the review of 4,000 odd GEF projects. So we use various evaluation methods such as document analysis, statistical analysis, remote sensing, interviews. And we also deep dived into 7 conflict and fragile situations such as Colombia, Balkans, Mali, the countries within the Albertine Rift in the Central Africa, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Lebanon. And we found that more than 1/3 of the GEF portfolio is within the countries affected by major armed conflict. Several of our evaluations have provided evaluative evidence on how fragility and conflict affect the outcomes and sustainability of GEF support. So our analysis found that the majority of the GEF projects are in fragile and conflict affected situations. And when you look at the fragile countries and territories receiving GEF funding, you find that majority of them are within the warning and alert classification of fragility. And comparatively, less projects are within stable and sustainable classification of fragile countries. Similarly, in terms of the countries affected by major armed conflict, we found that 29% of the GEF investment in terms of dollar value was going into the areas that are affected by conflict, and 15% of it going into areas that are mixed. So could be conflict or not conflict, and only 45% of these investment are going into non-conflict situations. Similarly, in number of projects term, 33% of the projects were going into conflict affected countries, and 11% in mixed, so could be conflict, could not be conflict, and almost 50% of the projects were situated in the countries that are not affected by conflict. So even by conservative measures, if we say that 1/3 of the projects were situated in the countries that have been affected by conflict. So that itself is a huge number. So how does conflict and fragility affect GEF investment? And here we found that fragility and conflict affect the entire project cycle. So fragility and conflict have statistically significant impact on all performance indicators. Countries' fragility classification is also associated with the statistically significant impact on the likelihood of projects being cancelled or dropped, as well as increased duration of delays. And when you look at the graph here in terms of the impact of conflict and fragility on GEF investment, we see that the conflict and fragile situation not only affects the overall outcome. So in terms of overall outcome, you can see for the entire GEF portfolio, the 84% of the projects are satisfactory, but in conflict situation, the number is about 70%. It affects the sustainability most, as you can see here, that the sustainability of projects in conflict and fragile situation is only 46%. So only 46% of the projects are likely to be sustainable compared to 73% at the GEF portfolio level. The evaluation also identified key pathways through which conflict and fragility affect GEF projects. And these are physical insecurity, and we know that it's not secure to work in fragile and conflict situation. Similarly, we see that the fragility and conflict also lead to social conflict and mistrust. Economic drivers are also an outcome of a conflict and fragile situation. The conflict and fragile situation also lead to political fragility and weak governance, and sometimes the coping mechanism in the light of conflict and fragility also affect the GEF programming and GEF interventions. So overall, conflict and fragility not only affects the results, but it also affects the relevance, the effectiveness, the efficiency, as well as the sustainability of the projects. Now I would like to highlight some key findings. And these are that there was inconsistent identification of conflict-related risk in the GEF projects. The GEF has so far not developed conflict-sensitive safeguards, policies, guidance that are necessary to systematically manage these risks. Also, we found that half of the GEF agencies have developed policies, strategies, and toolkits to address challenges posed by conflict and fragile situations. The evaluation also found that the shift in priorities associated with conflict can negatively affect the relevance of the projects. For instance, if we are trying to save an important biodiversity, there are chances that due to conflict, the priorities might shift, and therefore the relevance that was to save an important species could also change. Similarly, the conflict impacts human rights, indigenous peoples, gender, and Jeff's ability to engage with private sector. We also saw that there was an increase in the duration of the project, and therefore delays in the project due to the conflict and fragile situation. Also, as I already mentioned, that the fragility and conflict negatively affects outcome, sustainability, implementation, execution, monitoring and evaluation of the project. So it's all pervasive. It affects all the aspect of a project or a program cycle. Our evaluation also highlighted some risk management strategies that the projects or the programs have adopted to deal with the fragile and conflict situation. So the first and the very basic is acknowledgement and risk management action in the projects. So many projects, they will just acknowledge that there is a risk of conflict or fragility and move from there. Some projects apply avoidance. So here they will not go to certain areas. Other projects, they try to mitigate by various ways, by training, monitoring and early warning, participatory approach, working with local partners, having a very dedicated dispute resolution mechanism through adaptive management. Some projects also use conflict as an opportunity for peace building. And the last risk management strategy that we identified is learning. So learning from the previous experience on what has worked and what has not worked in these situations. Here's a quick example from Lebanon using HEMA. And here the project engaged a customary approach for conservation and conflict management. So HEMA is a local community conservation area that was utilized to encourage sustainable resource use and conservation. And in this case, HEMA functions as a critical conflict management tool. So based on our evaluation, there are few strategic takeaways for us all. And the first one is conflict and fragility matter. These contexts present risks, but also opportunities, as we have seen in terms of learning, in terms of environmental peace building. Projects in fragile and conflict affected settings should be approached differently than non-conflict affected projects. Also, there is a necessity for plan for volatility and to create contingency measures. Also, one must remain flexible and seek creative solution in these situations. Also, the other strategic takeaway for us is to take the time to become familiar with the local conflict dynamics and find ways to stay updated as they change, because we know conflict and fragile situations could be very dynamic, and we need to understand the context and stay updated as they change. Also, create meaningful, trusting relationship with local partners and respect their expertise of the environment. And last but not the least, institutions need to provide guidance, policies, safeguards, and trained staff to support conflict-sensitive programming. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention. And if you're more interested, you can read the entire report on our website. The evaluation is known as the evaluation of GEF support to fragile and conflict affected situation. And if you have any further question, please feel free to write to us.
Again, virtually thanks to Anupam. As you see, it's very much interesting to see how GEF has evaluated its entire program, how 30% of GEF program is actually in fragile and conflict-related areas, and how conflict affected the sustainability of GEF projects. We're talking about $4 billion investment of GEF projects in fragile context. So that program of evaluation is really great to see it from the GEF, knowing how it's important. Now, concluded the economic dimension of fragility, I'd like to also conclude the technical, let's say, discussion before the panel with a presentation on valuing, restoring, and managing presumed dryland assessment on the occasion of launching a report by FAO, which is globally launched today, actually. So, and I would like to welcome my colleague, actually, Ms. Fida Haddad, forestry officer at the at FAO in Rome, to present the report to you. Thanks, Fida.
Thank you, Maher. Good afternoon, everyone. So allow me to stand up here at least to energize the group, especially after the lunch we have. The lunch, the food that already produced 60% of our food are coming from dry lands. And now we are here to launch another category of might come also degraded, presumed dry land. You want to take photo for me? Okay. All right. Good. Okay, so let me give you background about what we are launching today. So in 2019, FAO launched at the UNCCC the first global dryland assessment, trees, forest in drylands. But the work started in 2015 until 2019, where 200 experts worked together to analyze the geospatial data with the actual finding on the ground to come up with this report. In this report, we identified, as mentioned by UNEP WCMC, about the category of presumed dryland. But we didn't launch it, and now, today, we launched the, double-click, this report, the presumed dryland. But what we did in this presumed dryland is linking the geospatial data into best practices, and then conducted an economic valuation analysis to identify the cost benefits of restoring, valuing these presumed dryland to achieve the land degradation neutrality and alert the decision makers on the status of this presumed dryland. Now I'm talking presumed dryland, but what is a presumed dryland? Of course, we are all experts on the definition of dryland, which is below the aridity index of 0.65. But presumed dryland is equal or more 0.65 aridity index. Why it's looking to dryland? Because it has most of the dryland features, and the most features is the drought and the fragility of these areas in dryland. Now, the assessment found that in total, if we count the dryland, we will have 7 billion hectares. 48% will be the drylands. Out of this is the 7% is presumed dryland. 1 billion hectares are in danger to be further degraded. Please. This map already, as I mentioned, it's not a new category, already alerted by UNEP WCMC in 2007 about this category of presumed dryland. And here we can identify that where are these presumed drylands in which continent? In Africa, Latin America, and part of Asia. But what we did in our assessment is that we zoomed into these areas and identified exactly where are these areas globally. And globally, we found that the presumed dryland, the 7%, has 30% of forest, and then the second category is the grassland, which is 27%. And here is our map where we identified the 3 big areas where we have the presumed dryland in Cerrado, Brazil, Miampo Mopane ecoregion in southern Africa, and in Kilgahai Tepato Plateau, East, Central, West Asia, mainly in the desert of China. Please. Okay, so as I mentioned, we first have this global analysis, the geospatial data, analyzed it globally, and then we zoomed into the 3 study area where we found the most presumed dryland. The first study area was Cerrado, a presumed dryland in Brazil. So what we did first is we tried to find from different literature reviews, meetings with stakeholder experts about the best practices, challenges, drivers of degradation in these areas. Now we know that we have a lot of projects, initiatives are there, but nothing mentioned that these drivers are in the location of presumed dryland. And this is what was one of our challenge, to find exactly what are going on in these areas. So Cerrado, presumed dryland, has 174 million, which represents 45% as a forest, grassland 37%, and the cropland, the expansion of cropland around 60%. Trees outside the forest count of 40% in Cerrado. As I mentioned, we identified the causes of degradation in Cerrado and opportunities and best practices from current initiatives and past initiatives, and we came up with the in general drivers in Cerrado, which is well known to most of us: the expansion of crop production, mainly the soya bean, and the use of fertilizer and the infrastructure, plus the change in the land cover, land use in Cerrado caused also the deforestation and caused the degradation in Cerrado. But at the same time, we found and analyzed most of initiatives, the project, and we found that the agroforestry systems proved that it can be a solution to help restoring the dryland, the presumed dryland in Cerrado, and increase the performance of the cattle of the pastoral land. Now, the most important part is that we linked again this information, best practices, and translated into dollars to support the decision makers understanding the criticality of degradation. And the scenario we conducted is actually in 2 scenarios: the business as usual scenario and the land degradation neutrality scenario. So we analyzed the change in the crop cover, the land cover and the crop changes in Cerrado, with the link of the precipitation and the change in rainfall precipitation in Cerrado as well, taken into consideration the climate change. The final analysis was based on analyzing the profitability of crop production in Cerrado, as well as giving a monetary value for the carbon emission. Please, the second, please. Okay, and we found that, let me explain exactly the figures, that the climate-related damage costs are in order of USD 133 billion. And the loss of agricultural productivity due to the expansion of soya crop production, around 105 billion USD dollar. Can you please? Okay. So at the same time, we found out of the analysis that the market failed in Cerrado to convince the farmers to stop expansion the soya bean, and that the cost of the native species are not valued in Cerrado with the farmers, different stakeholders, because the profits are not, the revenue of stop expansion of the soybean are not of the profit of the farmers or the users. But what we found are the three key messages to support the avoid degradation in Cerrado. We have to find out the finance scheme, carbon finance scheme, because the current carbon finance scheme in Cerrado failed to support the stop expansion. So we have to find more innovative finance scheme. For example, payment of ecosystem services was one of the best solution explained by different experts for the water infiltration and engagement with different stakeholders. Also, there is a need to work on the land ownership and the tax to support farmers, to avoid further crop expansion. In addition to the, as well known, the subsidies for the agricultural, we have to stop the subsidies for different agriculture and support. The most important part is for the land degradation neutrality scenario. The land degradation neutrality scenario highlighted that we can stop the degradation of the remaining part of Cerrado by ensuring the agroforestry part, by ensuring the livestock management for the food security part in Cerrado, while we are working on land reform, tax reform on the other part that is degraded. Yeah, so that was main finding on Cerrado. The second important ecoregion is Miampomopane woodlands, presumed dryland, which is located in the southern Africa. And happy that we have one of the decision makers here in Miampomopane to hear about the needs of restoring that land. In Cerrado, the analysis found that 265 million hectares represent 44% as forest, and then the grassland, 25%, cropland is 13%. But the trees outside the forest accounts 53% out of the whole Cerrado. And we all know about Cerrado and their native species and the numerous ecosystem services for this ecoregion. Can you please? Okay. Again, we did the same as we did for Cerrado. We analyzed the drivers and the challenges of degradation in Miampomopane and find out the opportunities and best practices. The main challenge in that region, the Cerrado, is the overgrazing, overgrazing and the charcoal production, along with the production of tobacco and different timber products. But again, the opportunities here were, according to the experts and the best practices identified, again, the agroforestry part, with working on the silvopastoralism system, incorporating the best practices for pastorals and farmers, and adaptive management to having different corridors, like the using of rain corridors, cultivation of sandy rivers, and adjusting the traditional farming systems in Cerrado. The valuing case in Cerrado for regenerating tree cover within the croplands in Miampomopane, please. In Miampomopane. So first we did kind of literature review about the crop yield synergies in Miampomopane, with a critical analysis on to determine the challenges of the farmland, the continuity of farmland with the loss of a tree canopy cover in Cerrado. So, no, please. Yeah. The focus was in 5 countries, Mozambique, Tanzania, Angola, Zimbabwe, and Zambia for this analysis, but we took Tanzanian net rate analysis to identify the possibilities of between business as usual and land degradation neutrality scenarios. Under land degradation neutrality scenarios, we had 2 options. The first is we stipulating the stability of tree cover within the cropland, and the land degradation neutrality scenario 2, stipulating the increase in crop the increase in crop production within the tree canopy cover. And we found that even though, taking Tanzania as an example, even though there will be an increase in the productivity, farmers were not interested, or the scenario is not enough to convince the farmers to use the farmer regenerating managed natural resources, FPMNR system. So we found that farmers need to have, and we need to work on the land tenure. Can you move, please? We need to work on the land tenure issues to allow the farmers enjoy the benefits of regenerating trees and cover in their ecoregion. The analysis also showed that the income from the forest product in the farm where the farmers used the FPN system is much more than the normal farmland. But as I said, the regulation, legislation around the situation, we need to work more on the land tenure issues to allow the farmers to benefit from the farmland. The last and the quick on the study area in West-East Central Asia, in Qinghai, Tibeto Plateau, mainly was in China desert. So the degradation and in the main area here is an actual desert degraded due to the overgrazing and change in the traditional, let's say, pastoralism system in Tibeto Plateau ecoregion, in addition to the decrease of the vegetation cover, caused that region to go into the hyper, like beyond the hyper degradation. Can I move one? Yeah. And in Tibeto Plateau, we didn't do economic valuation. That's for the next stage. But here we tried to identify what are the best practices, what are the current conditions that can support this ecoregion to avoid further degradation. And we found that policies that are focusing on improving the pastoralism system in that region, according to the literature reviews and the consultation with different stakeholders, prove that can be an actual, like a positive change to avoid further degradation on these lands. So in general, the publication that I hope that you will enjoy reading it and have a lot of figures, data that translated into economic figures to support the decision makers and to show that we are in a critical situation of having extra 1 billion hectares degraded, will be degraded unless we take action now on avoiding having these presumed dry land with the having more features of dry lands. And as I mentioned, the economic scenarios showed that land degradation neutrality is the best option to move toward integrated landscape approach management and avoiding further degradation. But at the same time, we need to improve the monitoring tools and monitoring purposes with the decision makers to take an action on avoiding further degradation on presumed dry land. So I hope you enjoy the publication. You find it online. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fida, actually, for this review. I think food helped us with energy, but made us some delay. Yeah. So I thank the presenters again, and then we move to another session, which I hope will be interesting. So I hand it over to my colleague Eva for a dialogue with a number of experts in a panel discussion. So I invite the guests to come to the podium here, please. Yeah.
A bit of setting. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, everyone. Yes, we have a bit of delay, but I hope we can compensate you with this fantastic discussion with our experts. I would call our fourth guest, she's still organizing her thoughts. Please. So today we have been talking about multidimensional fragility, and the idea behind to have this group of experts next to me was just to shed light, just to investigate the multidimensional fragility from different perspectives. So I would not really take much time from them, and I would start the introduction. I would start with posing question to our experts. So our first speaker is Lee N. Vinaviatska. Lee is the global research team leader in the World Agroforestry based in Kenya. She's a soil scientist, and her research focuses on scaling farmer-centered landscape restoration and understanding soil organic carbon dynamics. She has developed and implemented the land degradation surveillance framework in over 40 countries to assess ecosystem health. She co-leads the Coalition of Action for Soil Health from the United Nations Forum on Sustainable Standards, which aims to catalyze investment in soil health for human well-being and climate. Nice to meet you, nice to have you here. So Lee, the first question would be to you. So contexts affected by the scarcity of water and healthy soils, like drought-prone drylands, often go, unfortunately, hand in hand with poverty and food insecurity. So in the face of climate change, promoting adapted agri-food systems call for the protection and sustainable and integrated management of natural resources in drylands, possibly more than elsewhere. According to your experience, what are at least some of the approaches that should be adopted at community scale to achieve this objective, and how can we promote their uptaking by farmers and pastoralists? So the words, thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you to the organizers for an invitation to be here with all of you. Restoring drylands is of critical urgency, and as Ms. Benani from IOM mentioned, focusing on restoration will not only have the potential to reduce conflict, but also to provide opportunities for those to stay, but I liked her point, but also provide opportunities for those on the move. So that's the first time I heard that. So thanks for sharing that insight. And that means we need to really understand the particular options that work in some areas, and then we need to understand how those options can be tailored to meet the needs of the people in other areas. So in other words, there's no silver bullet. And this is the next point. So Ibrahim Thiaw opened many sessions this week, and he talked about science and evidence and the need to connect this data, these data sets, with implementation on the ground. So when we're talking about developing options, we need to really understand the role of science and evidence to guide and inform these investments. So essentially, we call this co-learning, to make it sound less boring than monitoring and assessing, and learning with communities. So for example, at C4ECRAF, we're really moving toward on-farm restoration options, and I think the last speaker, Ms. Haddad, really highlighted the options that farmers, pastoralists, in the presumed drylands, I will try to use that terminology now, can tailor to meet their context. So as a scientist, this is a place where we can have co-learning, where we can be monitoring what's working, where, for whom, and we call this kind of a assisted citizen science. And the last slide of Ms. Haddad was about the need for harmonized monitoring and mapping, and this is exactly what I wanted to talk about, which is how we can combine these systematic assessments to understand land degradation, soil erosion prevalence, not just tree cover, we need to get to tree biodiversity, soil carbon, remember I'm a soil scientist, and how these interventions impact these key ecosystem services for that context. So already, my question was partially answered by Fida when she said agroforestry, and specifically looking at farmer-managed natural regeneration. But also there's key principles that we need to think about in the drylands. So one, or globally actually, keeping the soil covered, right? If we want to build healthy soil ecosystems, we also need to stop, curb erosion. We need to do anything we can to stop the soil from leaving the farm so that we can build healthy soil ecosystems. And then of course, we have to stop taking soil for granted and taking minerals and water from it, and we need to give back. So some people like the term regenerative. Dr. Lal and I like the term giving back to the soil. So giving back in terms of nutrients, compost, composted farmyard manure, putting leaves on the surface. And so these are the types of principles that we can use to then tailor, okay, which type of manure, which type of soil water conservation, which types of trees for the agroforestry. So that's my main message, is making sure that we are tailoring options to meet the farmer and pastoralist needs, and then making sure that we're having the co-learning process, this data collection, this harmonized monitoring and mapping to really inform future investments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. Yes, actually, thank you. Sorry. Can you please repeat, because she deserves more, I think. Okay. Thanks so much. So actually, you articulated how important it is to tailor options to the need of the farmers. And our next speaker, one of her specialties is how we target communities. I would like to introduce you Ms. Simbongile Mavimbela. She's Senior Program Officer managing the Environment and Climate Change Unit at the Southern African Development Community SADC Secretariat. Her work is related to the sustainable management of the environment for socio-economic development in the SADC region. Ms. Simbongile is responsible for the collaboration, resource mobilization, and execution of activities in 16 countries. So my question to you would be the importance of traditional knowledge to protect drylands and ensure effective use of resources coming to the fore, but still not always leveraged. In your view, is it necessary to consider traditional practices in adaptation, and what are the community-driven practices and approaches that can be adopted regardless of specific contexts? How should we build vertical partnerships to upscale communities' know-how and account for them in national policies and frameworks? So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Quite a long question. I hope I'll be able to answer it adequately.
Myself, I don't remember the beginning of it.
Yes, but just to give you a bit of a background, the SADC region is the southern part of the African continent, composed of 16 countries, and 13 out of those 16 countries are food insecure due to very low levels of rainfall. Particularly in recent years, we have been having an acute shortage of rainfall that affects food production and other developmental priorities in the region. Just 45 million people in the region are food insecure currently. And due to the significant decrease in rainfall, between December 2021 and March 2022, we have had 336 people facing acute food insecurity, and this is a crisis level and above, and those need immediate humanitarian assistance. And then we have 50,000 people which are in the emergency level of desperation, and then 376,000 are in the stressed mode. So looking at these statistics, even those in stressed mode or in a lower level of crisis, if the droughts continue, they migrate into the emergency mode as well. So it's a continuous process which is degenerating into a serious challenge in our region. Now, most of our population is rural. 70% of the SADC population is rural and depends on subsistence farming and a few pastoral farmers as well. I'm South African. In South Africa, we have a high level of commercial farming, large-scale farms. But if you compare the impact of a drought on a commercial farmer and a rural subsistence farmer, the rural subsistence farmer is mostly hard hit. Because if I have 10 goats and there's a drought over a whole year with no rain, then all my 10 goats will die, compared to a large-scale commercial farmer that can absorb quicker, and out of 1,000 goats, maybe half will die, but the rest will survive and regenerate in the next season. So we do have a crisis, and the drought has become more and more prominent in the region. We have countries like Madagascar that have continuously suffered. In one country, in Madagascar, you have cyclones on one side of the country and acute shortage of water and drought on another side of the country in the same country. So they are suffering a great deal. Did I answer that question? Yes. Indigenous knowledge systems, yes. My colleague already spoke about citizen science. With a population which is highly rural and indigenous, we have always relied on indigenous knowledge and common knowledge and natural systems. We have always survived using those systems. But there is a need for assistance because the drought patterns are becoming more and more prominent, more recurrent, and more intense and severe. So there's a need to merge indigenous knowledge systems with commercial science, with conventional scientific systems, and merge the two and make sure we maximize in all possible knowledge systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's very interesting how to handle when we have multiple disasters at the same time. So it really demands some kind of coordination and harmonization and a good governance. So the expertise, yes, sorry, I try to rush time. We are a bit late and we are going to be kicked out. I'm trying to rush. I'm sorry for the. So the expertise of our next speaker, Jess Weigelt, who's head of program in the Töpfer Müller Gaster think tank for sustainability. Mr. Weigelt is responsible for co-steering TMG's programs and overall strategic development. He has more than 10 years experience in providing science-based policy advice in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. His thematic interests span natural resources, governance, transitions to sustainability, co-creation of knowledge, and social innovation. So I would pose my next very long question to you. A key driver of fragility in drought-prone drylands is the resilience of limited land and water resources. In the frequent lack of established frameworks for the sharing of resources, their access and use are generally based on customary rules that often generate disputes and conflicts. Although out-migration can be an adaptation strategy for livelihood living in fragile contexts like drought-prone drylands, a demographic growth is expected in these areas in the coming years. Are there effective approaches to reduce competition over resources and reduce vulnerability of human ecosystems accordingly? And what tools exist? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eva, and thanks to our host, FAO, for convening us here, and thank you all for attending this challenging early afternoon session. And Eva, I appreciate the trust that you placed in us with these very challenging questions after lunch, so I'll try to do justice to respond. First of all, I think I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for emphasizing the multi-dimensional nature of fragility. Fragility cannot be understood if we only look at the natural science component of fragility. If I think of vulnerable or farmers in vulnerable situations in rural South Africa, this cannot be understood without actually looking at the legacy of apartheid. So there is a strong political dimension attached to the question of fragility, and I very much appreciate and embrace really the multi-dimensional framework that you outlined for the session, because it allows new alliances to push this difficult question matters forward. To respond to your question, or trying to respond to your question, we have just yesterday celebrated the 10th anniversary of the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land. FAO has invested heavily in producing technical guidance for its members in assisting member states in implementing these ambitious set of guidelines. And I think the technical guidance is there, and this ranges from, to respond to your question, from participatory mapping of legitimate land tenure rights to land use mapping, all these instruments that we know. I would add, though, to address the political element that we just mentioned, it is absolutely essential that at the local level, civil society is being strengthened to hold those in power accountable so that these measures are actually being used and implemented. I think, and fortunately I can speak freely as I'm not bound by any specific mandate here. I think technical guidance is absolutely essential and pivotal on the pathway to move from fragility to resilience. But I think we have all seen a high number of very ambitious policies that have not really met the ground. And I would say that in order to make these policies hit the ground, we have to enhance accountability measures from the local people to actually demand the implementation of these practices. So acknowledge the rights and responsibilities and obligations, and enhance accountability would be my pitch for ensuring that the pathway to resilience can be found. This is both to enable the innovations that Lee has been talking about, to actually enable co-learning. The land users need to have a safe space to actually innovate, and this refers to safeguarding so that large infrastructure projects do not violate these rights. So this is my pitch. The negotiations on the land tenure decision have started today in the Committee of the Whole. Just the fellow delegates and civil society members, go find your delegate and push for an ambitious agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, yes, and thank you for being honest. I do agree that we have so many fancy policies, we have so many fancy strategies, yet not implemented. And I do believe that one of the constraints of really implementing these policies is the access to finance is restricted. So we need to increase finance. Our next expert, this is her expertise, Ms. Aissata Salsila, coordinator of the Climate Finance Unit of the Centre de Suivi Écologique. She's a senior expert in charge of the coordination of the Centre's Climate Finance Unit, both in terms of projects and programs development, implementation and monitoring. She's also the vice chair of the Community of Practice for Direct Access Entities, with specialization in geography and climate science. Aissata accounts 10 years of experience in field of environment. So the question to you, the Centre de Suivi Écologique was the first national implementing entity accredited by Adaptation Fund over 10 years ago. That's a huge achievement. The agency is aware of the importance of targeted investments to address the resilience of vulnerable livelihoods, like those living in drought-prone drylands. In your view, does the current commitment of global finance respond to the needs of this context, and how should investment be balanced between the support to current activities and stakeholders and the promotion of transformative changes to exploit the potential?
Okay, thank you so much, Eva, for your question, and sorry guys by my broken English. Okay, please let me briefly present who we are and what our area of expertise. CSE is a center of excellence specialized in environmental monitoring and sustainable management of natural resources based on special information from the advanced technology. As such, its position as a provider of data, information, and services. In the field of climate change, CAC has become over the years of reference in Senegal, in Africa. It is the first national implementing entity worldwide to be accredited by the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. Therefore, I'm very comfortable with sharing my opinion and answering your question. Ultimately, many challenges exist for global finance to effectively address the specific needs of communities affected by resource degradation. The current commitment to global sustainable development financing is unfortunately not sufficient to meet the needs of this context due to the relatively low level of investment and their sporadic nature. From this point of view, development financing needs to take over from the action initiated to improve their effectiveness and scope. And for the other question, the commitment of global finance to support efforts to combat land degradation for the benefit of the most vulnerable communities should be more tailored to country specificities. The basis of our intervention must be based on sound scientific data and monitoring and evaluation method adapted to the local context. Human capital, such the researchers, decision makers, must be able to support initiative in terms of response provided, like technology deployed, approaches, monitoring, etc. In other words, there is a need to harmonize intervention to avoid duplication. It is important to create a synergy between the convention like climate change, biodiversity, desertification for more pooling and added value. Perhaps this collaboration exists. The balance of investment between supporting current activities and actors and promoting transformative changes in the economy is all the more necessary as current funding does not cover existing needs. Therefore, a better focus on transformative change would allow resources to be used as set money for large-scale action based on their transformative potential. Thank you, and sorry for my broken English.
It was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, actually, we arrived to our last intervention. I think in terms of decent gender balance, this panel is quite overperforming, but another good news that we can have a youth representative on board. I would like to introduce you Sumaya Zadem, North Africa representative in the Youth Advisory Board on Disaster Risk Reduction on Africa Union. Ms. Zadem is a biological engineer with over 9 years of work experience in the fields of environment, climate change, food security, sustainable development, and disaster risk reduction. Currently, she's a board member responsible for foreign affairs and external relations in the Arab African Council for Sustainable Development, an international organization based in Tunisia. She serves also as North Africa representative of the Africa Youth Advisory Board on Disaster Risk Reduction of the African Union. So, future is in the hand, or the future is in the hand of our children and in the hand of the young people. So my question would be around this topic. Increasing public awareness beyond the limited audience of practitioners and farmers is a key condition to promote dryland restoration and efficient uses of resources at large scale. How future generation can help paradigm shift towards a proactive drought management in drylands? would you consider that youth are already active and are in board? And from the other way around, how do you think that the global community should promote young role models in this context?
Thank you so much. And I'm happy to be here today and talk from the youth perspective. We all know how youth are important, and I want to pick a sentence that one of the panelists said, that if we want to hate the ground, hate the policies, the ground, we need to implement those policies. And we believe that for those policies to be implemented, we need youth to help implement it. So we need all policymakers to help and facilitate the integration of youth and make their voices heard. So if we talk about the drought management in dryland, we talk about challenges. Challenges like mitigation, preparedness, response, and monitoring and early warning system. We need to integrate young people to implement those, to overcome those challenges. Young people have demonstrated strengths, for instance, through social media, their ability to connect across generations and countries, and a strong willingness to step up and act when facing extreme weather events. So the failure to include young people in policy processes remains the most important hurdle for youth engagement in policy making. When given the opportunity, young people actively contribute to the decision making, create their own avenues, and promoting values of intergenerational justice and equity. It's vital, therefore, to draw their voices into the discussion and empower them to lead the solutions. We must support them in their actions, particularly in regions where youth participation in political processes may be constrained. Youth must not be reduced to passive victims of climate meltdown. We have a crucial role to play by becoming champions of a low-carbon, climate-resilient future. The sooner we make them an integral part of the decision-making and solution that will shape the future of our world, the better. I would like to mention from my experience as a former consultant at UNESCO, we had two amazing opportunities that brought youth on board and show how institutions and international organizations can help and push youth to shape to shape their future. The first experience was develop the content of a mobile application on DRR, in disaster risk reduction, and it's called No DRR. I invite you all to download from the App Store the application. It's for young people to enhance their knowledge, understanding about disaster risk reduction and sustainable development and climate change. And as I am member, Africa Youth Advisory Board, I am proud to be one of these, the developer of this application, just to enhance their knowledge about what we are facing. And the second opportunity was develop a guideline in meaningful youth engagement in disaster risk reduction in Africa. And this is like, we try to collect data. And I want to mention something here. Like, we faced a lot of challenges about collecting data, and this is what we need to work on, side to side with policymakers, with the governments, to build on technology, to try to improve data, because once we have all the information, we can overcome all the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this beautiful intervention. Well, actually, we could hear about fragility from different perspectives. You could hear from soil science to governance, from resource mobilization to inclusive development. It was extremely interesting. It was a fantastic discussion. Thanks so much for being with us. And I think we have some time for question and answers because I see the organizers are still quite patient with us. So I would like to ask the audience if there is any question. We have question.
You can do it from there.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thanks for the presenter for an excellent session. I'm not an expert in drylands or environmental issues. I'm a political analyst, and so I have 3 quick questions. I wanted to know if there's just a coincidence that most of the drylands happen to be in the developing world. Is it a coincidence, or is it something that has to do with a political legacy or mismanagement of land, or it's just that it's just a fate? And the second question is about science, and I was wondering is, between the combination of local knowledge and modern technology, how do you make that balance? Because you see in some areas that, that local communities have been able to, over centuries, to manage climate shocks and droughts. And so I wonder, what is needed in the new technology that makes a difference? And then the third one is actually for Hind. It's on migration. And I wonder, I think it's a fact that more and more we will see, whether you call them climate migrants and so on, but there's still a negative connotation, I think, attached to migrants. I never really, and I think, Hind, you said there's a strength in migration, but I think it doesn't really come across in the narrative. And I wonder what should be done in terms of that. If that is indeed the future, what is needed to communicate in a more positive way the new world that we will be living in? Thanks.
Thank you for the questions. I would pick up first the second question, if you don't mind, and I would address it to Leanne. Science and traditional knowledge.
No, it's such a great question because we do talk about this blending of knowledge systems, and I just think that things are happening so rapidly, and as Ms. Haddad presented, now we're even, having to classify new systems because the climate is changing so rapidly, and that's where I think the science and local knowledge can really come in, right? Because the local knowledge has developed over a long period of time, but now we're seeing climate change just incredibly rapidly changing. And so I think the only way that we're going to be able to address these issues is to literally and physically come together with our minds, our ideas, our ambitions, our motivation to develop these solutions together, because it's just happening at a pace we've never seen before. Was that my cue to stop?
I almost fell on you. The next question I think I would like to address it to Hind, if you don't mind.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Ngozi, for your question. I think that my answer would be kind of straightforward. I think that there is an important, it's important to challenge the narrative of migration. So I would speak only about the region in which I'm based, so West and Central Africa. I mean, there is an extremely distorted narrative over migration when you read the papers, the newspapers, and so it's very also important to realize that the huge majority of environmental induced migration is an internal one or an intra-regional one. So it's very important to produce evidence to feed the narrative. So challenging the narrative is very important. Being bold also about the narrative of our migration at least in the region where I do cover. I also, maybe there is this report which is called like Challenging the Narrative, the African Migration Report produced by IOM and the African Union. And the first chapter is about how to challenge this narrative, and I think also keep on producing evidence, and exactly as Ms. Lian said, I think that it's very important to be close to the communities, to document the perception of the population, to feed not only, I mean, just like to tick the box of participation, but also to feed, produce knowledge and feed policies with local knowledge. I mean, people are not waiting for us to adapt. People are not waiting for us to to practice solidarity in case of, I don't know, conflict, disaster, etc. And we should build on this perception and also practices. So being closer to the needs of the communities and also the practices of the communities. And also producing evidence and challenging the narrative of our migration, which is unfortunately sometimes too much, again, donor-oriented. I dare to say that as IOM, but I think it's very important. When you look at environmental migration, the realities are not about, the realities are mostly internal, and it's very important to work on this internal migration too. Thank you.
And I think part of the question could be addressed to FIDA.
Well, my colleagues already addressed them, but I want to highlight one thing related to our assessment, for example. The economic valuation used the local knowledge practices and turn them into figures. So when you read the assessment, you find that we link the local information, the local practices, and convert them into dollars to convince the decision makers how we should move toward restoring the degraded land in these areas. So this is the new way also of how we should find out the local knowledge, upscale it into the science, into the monetary value, rather than just a proposed solution and then provide the figures. So, and this is what we try to also highlight in this part of analysis on presumed dry land.
Thank you very much. We would take another question. I think we had one. Could you use the mic?
Thank you very much. My question is, I have heard everything the panelists have said, the amazing interventions they have given. What I have come to realize is sustainability, innovation, policies, and practice. Where and how do we merge all these into scalable solutions on the topic at hand? Thank you.
So perhaps we pick up more questions and we will answer them together. Yes?
Thank you very much. Mine is not a question really. It's a comment. I just wanted to reiterate an old Chinese proverb that says, when an old man dies, a whole library burns down. So libraries are burning down everywhere because our pace at documenting indigenous knowledge is not as fast as, the indigenous knowledge. The old people are still there to give us that knowledge. I know it's passed down from generation to generation, but it's being diluted along the way. So I would really like to plead with FAO, for example, to start research or to fund research into indigenous knowledge that can then be, put together with scientific knowledge to come up with strategies that will work, for the regeneration of our lands. Thanks.
I think it's much related to the question, and I would address this to Yes.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you for these very challenging and good questions. And obviously, scaling is always the result of very local and national factors, sort of finding these broad points that you can generalize to all countries of this globe are very limited. I would nevertheless like to emphasize 2 points that I really think are important. One is, and that you have mentioned this, I think it's absolutely essential to build on the community-led knowledge and initiatives to innovate and to manage and to restore resources. And I think wherever I've been to at this COP, this is increasingly being acknowledged. I think, or I fear it's not that much implemented as it's sort of now endorsed in these plenary halls, but I think this is one key component. I would add though, and this is a dimension that I sometimes keep missing in the discussions at this COP, is in order to sustain these community initiatives, in order to safeguard them, there needs to be an enabling environment for them. We cannot expect communities to fix misguided policies that maybe have sort of influenced natural resource patterns for the past 40 or 50 years. This is beyond what we can meaningfully expect communities to do, and this would be an unjust shifting of responsibilities. So I would say support community-led initiatives, but create an enabling environment so that they can properly act. Thank you very much, Eva.
Thank you very much. We would pick up the last question. I think, Madam, you had a question.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And I want to thank all the speakers who have presented. I came in when the speaker was standing at the corner there, was talking about the Miobo drylands. And then I've also listened to the, I think the 5th speaker, or the one talking about the disaster app and how to use technology. And my question is, the speaker spoke about how they were able to monitor the drylands and come up with the in monetary terms what is happening on the ground. So the question is, have they been able to pass this information or data or recommendation back to the farmers or the people on the ground, so that the drivers that are bringing these, disasters are able to be controlled? And how can we harness the issue of the app or the technology to come up with the information that is continuous to the farmer, so that we have smart farmers? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So I want just to highlight that this application is mainly for young people to understand more about disaster risk reduction and all the key, just to prepare before the disaster happen and how to respond after that. So if we are talking about providing application to farmers, I agree with you, it's important. So we need technology, we need the government have to work side by side to develop more application and do trainings and at local level to help farmers to understand the use of applications, but also we need finance to increase, to provide the resources. I hope that I answered your question. Thank you.
And regarding the monitoring part of the question, we would have, yes, a last quick intervention, if you don't mind.
The mics are different. I want to mention, because one of your part of your question is if we manage to translate or to inform the decision makers on these findings and how we can change the situation on the ground. So luckily now we have in FAO the new global impact program, dry landscape impact program, which is funded by Jeff 7. And FAO is leading the program with IUCN, WWF, and World Bank, and one of in 11 countries, and one of the main eco-region is Miampo-Mopane eco-region. So we just about to start the program now, and we are relying on the economic valuation assessment in designing the implementation to support the restoration in Miampo-Mopane. So we are targeting these countries. That was part of the analysis: Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia, and part of Miampo Mopane. And because we have also here SADC with us, we are aiming to support the community's engagement, the stakeholder knowledge sharing, and change the practices and disseminate the knowledge and link the common challenges with the best practices and upscale it at sub-regional level with support from SADC to disseminate and to strengthen the transboundary management of dryland in Miampo Mopane. So the reports come on time to start the implementation of this impact program, which will reflect this on the ground, hopefully.
Thank you very much. We have to stop the questions now because unfortunately we don't have more time and we would conclude. I just would like to ask you to support us with another ovation for our panelists. Thank you for everyone. I would give the floor to Michael, please, to close the session. And I would like to encourage you to stay here and we can have an open discussion together. We still have the time. Thank you.
Yeah, it's maybe better. Thank you very much, Eva. Yeah. I have a few points to add in my concluding remarks. I found it a very excellent session. Also time management, almost perfect. Oh no, perfect, no? With the delay. The topic is really at the heart, at the original heart of the convention. And I think the drylands and bringing together drylands, fragility, and sustainable development, perfect. I think that you are really here there. I don't want to summarize what I've heard. I want to make three remarks or takeaways from my side, which go maybe also a little bit beyond what we have already heard. 3 points. The first point, I think we should fully integrate disaster relief and rehabilitation into the planning in fragile drylands from the beginning. And that means involving international organizations like World Food Programme and civil society organizations which do this integration for decades already. That means that we have to think how these funds, these relief funds, can strategically build into the long-term development. We will know, and the title of FAO shows, it's a windy road to develop these drylands. And we will have to face droughts, other disasters in, let's say, in a decadal perspective. And to bring these two together in a kind of drought cycle management, I think that is very essential also we can use these resources. They are important. The second point is, I think that, and that has been, I like very much the intervention from the International Organization for Migration. We have to think about human activities not related to natural resource management for the drylands, and improve the resilience from the income side, and not only from the production, or let's say from income from natural resources, but from natural resource independent sources. So maybe also a focus on non-nature-based solutions. Not over-pronounce nature-based solutions, but because I think we will have faced situations where these drylands are no longer able to support the full population in these regions. We haven't talked about population growth, interesting, because that is also, of course, a driver. And in these regions, we have a strong population growth. And we have these disasters and so on, which will show sooner or later that natural resource or nature-based solutions alone will not be sufficient. So non-nature-based solutions must be a part of a solution portfolio. And the third point is, I think it's very important to capacitate not only users and communities, but also private funders, banks, microfinance organizations, and value chain financiers, so enterprises who are able and willing to fund sustainable solutions for farmers and for communities. If we achieve to not only improve the demand side, but also the supply side of these private financing actors for all activities, for both nature-based but also non-nature-based solutions, that is a very important path to lever public fundings and to make finance, also the financial side, sustainable and long-term. So these are my 3 points. I would again stress as a last remark that indeed making policies and governments accountable for all, that this all happens. Your point, yes, I think that is indeed crucial, but many of the solutions then have to be negotiated and found out by the private sectors themselves. And I would also say farmers are private sector. We shouldn't distinguish between farmers and private sector. Farmers react in this way, and we have to blend, that is the point, we have to blend their typical, usual business decision makings with these additional funds for sustainability and for all the terms, sustainability in financial, economic and ecological aspects. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael, for the closing remarks. I hope that we have made foundations for that triangular topic. And we really thank you all for being us the 2 hours, more than 2 hours, 2 and 30. And we look forward for more work from our side as FAO in partnership with you. And we may see you in other events. Thanks again. And with this, we close the event.
Allô.